What if I told you the most dangerous fault in America is not in California, and it's one that has been sitting silently under Missouri, Tennessee and Arkansas for over 2 centuries, and the government already knows exactly what happens when it breaks again? 86,000 dead, 7 million displaced, $300 billion gone. Those aren't guesses, that's federal modelling. Meanwhile, Memphis built a city on top of it. St. Louis built a city on top of it. Nashville is close enough to feel every bit of it, and almost none of those residents have ever heard the fault's name. I'll tell you the name, I'll tell you the science, and I'll tell you why the silence around this story is somehow more alarming than the fault itself. Don't go anywhere. Before we begin, if you genuinely enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe, because this story is about a clock with no hands and we are not looking away from it. Drop a comment, tell me where you're watching from, and tell me this. The last time this fault broke, it made the Mississippi River run backward, rang church bells 1,000 miles away, and reshaped the physical geography of an entire region. That happened with almost no one living there. Today, 10 million people are. The question is not whether this fault can do it again. The question is whether we are treating this with the seriousness it deserves. Tell me what you think. Now, let's get into this. Part 1. The Quiet Convergence. There is a fault system buried under the middle of America that federal models say could kill 86,000 people, displace 7 million more, and cause $300 billion in damage, and the majority of the people living directly above it have never heard its name. Not because the government is hiding it, not because the science is uncertain, but because somewhere between what scientists know and what the public believes, a gap opened up so wide that an entire civilization has been quietly building on top of a loaded gun without anyone thinking to mention it at dinner. That is the story we are telling today. And I want you to pay attention, because this one is personal whether you live in Memphis or Manhattan. Most Americans, when they think about earthquake risk, think about California. They picture the San Andreas Fault, the 1906 San Francisco disaster, the Hollywood disaster movies, the early warning apps on California phones. The narrative is so deeply embedded in American culture that asking someone to imagine a catastrophic earthquake in Missouri or Tennessee feels almost absurd. That is exactly the problem. The United States Geological Survey, the federal agency responsible for monitoring seismic hazard across the country, publishes updated national hazard maps every few years. If you pull up their most recent model and look at the colour gradients indicating ground shaking probability, you will notice something that should stop you cold. Stretching across a corridor from southern Illinois down through Missouri, Tennessee, Arkansas and into Kentucky and Mississippi, there is a zone of elevated seismic hazard that rivals, and in some frequency metrics exceeds, large sections of California. That zone sits directly over a feature called the New Madrid Seismic Zone. Roughly 200 small earthquakes are recorded there every single year by the Center for Earthquake Research and Information. 200. The ground beneath Memphis, Tennessee is not still. It is not dormant. It never was. It vibrates constantly at a low frequency that is easy to ignore because the events are too small to feel, too routine to make the news, and too inconvenient to fit into the mental model most Americans carry about where danger lives. But the data is there, published openly, updated continuously, available to anyone who wants to look. And what it shows is a fault system that is not sleeping. It is simply waiting below the threshold of human attention. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, the same agency that coordinates disaster response across the country, has modelled what a major New Madrid event would look like under modern conditions. The numbers they arrived at are not estimates designed to scare. They are operational planning figures built from soil maps, population density data, building stock inventories, and infrastructure vulnerability assessments. Up to 86,000 fatalities, $300 billion in economic damage, 7 million people displaced from their homes, 7 million. For context, Hurricane Katrina displaced approximately 1.5 million people, and it remains the most expensive natural disaster response in American history. The Federal Emergency Management Agency is describing an event nearly 5 times that scale of displacement, hitting a region with far less preparation, far fewer seismically engineered structures, and a population that, by every survey conducted on the subject, is almost entirely unaware of the risk. The perception gap here is not subtle. Researchers who study risk communication have conducted surveys across the central United States asking residents whether they know they live in a seismic zone. The results are consistently the same. Most people say no. Some people who have lived in Memphis their entire lives express genuine surprise when told their city sits within the projected damage zone of one of the most studied and documented seismic hazards in North America. That surprise is not their fault. It is a failure of communication, a failure of civic education, and a failure of the institutions that are supposed to translate scientific knowledge into public action. Here is what makes this so strange scientifically. The new Madrid Seismic Zone is what researchers call socially invisible. The fault does not express itself at the surface the way California faults do. There is no visible rupture line cutting through neighbourhoods. There is no dramatic mountain range or valley carved by millennia of lateral motion. The ground above it looks like ordinary farmland, river delta, and ordinary mid-American city. The danger is buried. The warning signs are written in a language, seismological data, liquefaction maps, FEMA scenario documents that requires translation before it reaches anyone who does not already work in earth science. Meanwhile, the infrastructure density across the Mississippi corridor has grown dramatically since researchers first began modelling New Madrid risk in a serious way. Rail lines, pipelines, interstate highways, river bridges, power transmission corridors, all of it layered over a zone that the science community has been quietly raising concern about for decades while the public conversation has remained almost completely static. This is not a hidden risk. It is an ignored one, and the difference between those two things matters enormously, because you can find something that is hidden. Something that is ignored was right in front of you the whole time. So let us go back to the last time this fault decided to remind everyone it existed. Because what happened in the winter of 1811 and 1812 was not just an earthquake. It was a geological event so extreme that it changed the physical shape of the continent, and it happened in a place where, mercifully at the time, almost no one was watching. Part 2. The last time it broke the continent. On the night of December the 16th, 1811, in the small hours before dawn, the ground beneath the lower Mississippi River Valley lurched. Not in the way a California earthquake lurches, that sharp, sudden jolt that rattles windows and sends objects off shelves. What witnesses described was something different. The ground moved like the surface of a disturbed lake. It rolled, it undulated in visible waves. People standing outside reported watching the earth itself ripple beneath their feet, as though the solid crust of the planet had briefly become liquid. That first event is estimated by modern seismologists, using indirect methods and historical accounts, to have reached somewhere between magnitude 7.2 and magnitude 7.8. It was followed by a magnitude 7 event on January 23, 1812, and then the largest of the sequence, by what researchers now estimate may have approached magnitude 8 on February 7, 1812. 3 major earthquakes within roughly 2 months, all originating from the same seismic zone, each one powerful enough to be considered a catastrophic standalone event by modern standards. And this is the part that matters for understanding why the new Madrid seismic zone is not just a regional concern, it is a national one. Church bells rang in Boston, not from any earthquake-related structure nearby. The seismic waves from southern Missouri and northern Tennessee travelled over 1,000 miles northeast, and still had enough energy to set iron bells swinging in their towers. In Washington, D.C., President James Madison felt the shaking. He was in the White House, roughly 900 miles from the epicenter, and the ground beneath the capital of the United States moved. The total felt area of the 1811 to 1812 sequence has been estimated at approximately 2.5 million square miles. 2.5 million. For comparison, the Great San Francisco earthquake of 1906, the event that defines American seismic disaster in the cultural memory, was felt across roughly 60,000 square miles. The New Madrid sequence was felt across an area more than 40 times larger. Let that sink in for a moment. 40 times the felt area. One single earthquake system, sitting in the middle of a continent, radiating enough energy to disturb the ground from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border, from the Atlantic seaboard to the edge of the Great Plains. If that event happened today, it would not be Memphis's problem. It would be the entire eastern half of the nation's problem simultaneously. The Mississippi River, one of the largest and most powerful rivers in the world, temporarily reversed its flow. In the aftermath of the February 7th main shock, eyewitness accounts described the river running backward for a period of hours. What geologists now understand is that the massive uplift of the riverbed created a temporary natural dam, forcing the current to reverse upstream of the obstruction. The shaking also triggered enormous bank collapses along the river, sending trees, soil and debris crashing into the water in simultaneous avalanches across hundreds of miles of river corridor. One of the most lasting physical monuments to those earthquakes still exists today. Reelfoot Lake in northwestern Tennessee, a shallow, roughly 13,000-acre body of water surrounded by the submerged trunks of cypress trees, was created entirely by the 1811 to 1812 sequence. The ground subsided. The river flooded the depression. The trees drowned in place. Today, those skeletal trunks still protrude from the water's surface, and if you visit Reelfoot Lake and understand what you're looking at, you're standing inside a scar left by one of the most powerful earthquake sequences ever recorded in North American history. Eyewitnesses described the experience of the earthquakes in terms that reveal how far outside ordinary human experience the event fell. One contemporary account describes the ground in continuous motion for so long that people lost track of time. Another describes standing near the river and watching the bank ahead simply disappear, swallowed by liquefaction, the process by which water-saturated soil loses its structural integrity under shaking and behaves temporarily like quicksand. Entire sections of riverbank, acres of land, slid into the Mississippi and vanished. Islands visible on pre-earthquake maps were gone when surveyors returned afterward. The aftershock sequence continued for months, not weeks, months. People living in the region never fully experienced ground that felt stable. The psychological toll on communities that were already isolated, already vulnerable, already living with almost no emergency infrastructure must have been extraordinary. And yet, because the population of the central Mississippi Valley in 1812 was sparse, a frontier region, lightly settled, mostly indigenous communities and small European-American outposts, the death toll, while significant, was not the civilizational catastrophe it would have been under modern conditions. That last sentence is the one that should stay with you. This happened once, with almost no population. The fault did not produce a smaller earthquake because fewer people lived above it. It produced exactly the same geological event it would produce today, in a world where 10 million people have built their homes and their cities, and their hospitals and their bridges directly in its path. The ground does not care how many people are standing on it when it moves. And as we're about to see, the physics of how those waves travel makes even the cities that feel safely distant catastrophically exposed. Part 3. The scale problem no one understands. Here is a fact that earthquake engineers know and almost no one else does, and it explains why the new Madrid Seismic Zone is so fundamentally different from the California risk that dominates the American imagination. The eastern United States sits on what geologists call a craton, an ancient, cold, extremely rigid section of continental crust that has been geologically stable for hundreds of millions of years. When an earthquake occurs within or near a craton, the seismic waves it generates do not dissipate quickly. The rigid crust transmits energy the way a tuning fork transmits a note, efficiently over long distances with relatively little loss. Compare that to the tectonically active, fractured and geologically complex crust of California, where seismic waves bounce off fault boundaries, scatter through broken rock and lose energy rapidly as they travel. The practical consequence of this difference is extraordinary. An earthquake in the eastern United States will typically be felt over an area 6 to 10 times larger than an earthquake of identical magnitude occurring in California. Not slightly larger, 6 to 10 times larger. The energy does not stay near the source. It radiates outward and stays coherent across distances that would be unimaginable in California's geology. Run those numbers against what we know about the new Madrid Seismic Zone, and the implications become uncomfortable very quickly. A major New Madrid earthquake would not only devastate the immediate epicentral region around Memphis, New Madrid, Missouri, and the surrounding counties, it would deliver damaging shaking to cities that, on a California mental model, would seem to be at a safe distance. Memphis, Tennessee, essentially at the center of the zone, would face the full force of the event. But St. Louis, Missouri, roughly 250 miles to the north, would face strong shaking. Nashville, Tennessee, roughly 200 miles to the east, would feel significant ground motion. Cincinnati, Ohio, over 400 miles away, would experience shaking capable of damaging older structures. Indianapolis, Louisville, even Atlanta, Georgia, over 500 miles from the New Madrid Zone, falls within the range where a maximum credible earthquake would deliver noticeable and potentially damaging motion. This is what researchers mean when they describe a distributed disaster footprint. There is no single city that gets hit while the others watch the news and donate to relief funds. The event is everywhere, simultaneously across a multi-state region, hitting infrastructure, triggering casualties, overwhelming emergency services, and creating competing demands for the same limited national response resources, all at the same time. And the emergency response problem this creates is almost impossible to overstate. When a major disaster hits a single city, the rest of the nation can mobilize toward it. Resources flow inward. Federal assets pre-position. Mutual aid agreements activate between neighboring states. The system works, more or less, because the disaster has a center and the response can organize around it. A major New Madrid earthquake does not have a single center in any operationally useful sense. The damage zone stretches from southern Illinois to northern Mississippi. The infrastructure disruptions, bridges down, pipelines ruptured, roads cracked, hospitals damaged, are scattered across Missouri, Tennessee, Arkansas, Kentucky, and beyond. The states that would normally send help to each other are simultaneously the states that need it. The mutual aid system, built on the assumption that disasters are local, encounters something it was not designed to handle. Every fire department in Memphis that loses apparatus to building collapses is a fire department that cannot respond to the fires that immediately follow major earthquakes when gas lines rupture. Every hospital in St. Louis that loses structural integrity is a hospital that cannot receive the injured being driven in from communities with no medical infrastructure at all. Every bridge on the Mississippi River that fails, and the Mississippi River bridges were not all built to seismic standards, is a logistics corridor severed, cutting the eastern United States off from the western United States at one of the most critical choke points in the national supply chain. The real danger here is not the magnitude. You can have a magnitude 7.5 earthquake in the right place, with the right preparation, and walk away with damages that are manageable. The real danger is the reach, the physics of eastern craton propagation transforming what would be a regional disaster in California into a continental event in Missouri. A fault in California is California's problem, and California has largely built its institutions to treat it that way. The New Madrid Seismic Zone is not Memphis's problem. It is America's problem, and America has not begun to treat it that way. Which raises the next question, one that becomes more alarming the more you think about it. The fault in 1812 ran through a frontier. How many people live in that same space today? Part 4. The Population Time Bomb. In the winter of 1811 and 1812, the lower Mississippi Valley was one of the least densely populated regions in North America. The United States Census of 1810 counted the entire state of Tennessee at approximately 260,000 people total for the entire state. Missouri was not yet a state. Arkansas was a territory with a population in the low thousands. The small city of New Madrid, Missouri, which gave the seismic zone its name, had perhaps 400 residents. The total number of people directly exposed to the worst shaking of the 1811 to 1812 sequence has been estimated at no more than 10,000 individuals across the entire epicentral region. 10,000. In a sparsely distributed frontier population with no multi-story masonry buildings, no elevated highway overpasses, no gas mains running beneath city streets. Today, the population directly exposed to major shaking in a New Madrid worst-case scenario exceeds 10 million people. Memphis, Tennessee, alone, has a metropolitan population of approximately 1.4 million. The St. Louis metropolitan area holds nearly 3 million. Nashville, which would experience significant shaking due to the craton propagation physics we just discussed, has grown to over 2 million in its metro area. The smaller cities, Jackson, Tennessee, Paducah, Kentucky, Cape Girardeau, Missouri, Jonesboro, Arkansas, add hundreds of thousands more in communities with even fewer resources and even less seismic preparation than the major metros. And here is the detail that makes the population exposure genuinely dangerous rather than simply large. Most of the growth in these cities happened during a specific period, roughly 1950 through 1990, when seismic considerations were not a meaningful part of how the central United States built things. California had experienced its disasters. California had updated its building codes. California's insurance industry had priced seismic risk into its products, creating financial incentives for construction upgrades. The central United States, which had not experienced a major damaging earthquake within living memory, and whose population had no cultural connection to the 1812 events, built its suburbs, its schools, its hospitals, its downtown commercial districts, and its apartment buildings as though the ground beneath them was geologically irrelevant. The exposure did not accumulate all at once. It crept in slowly, over decades, as Memphis built new neighborhoods on alluvial soil that would liquefy under strong shaking, as street. Lewis expanded its downtown with unreinforced masonry structures that perform catastrophically in earthquakes, as Nashville grew its urban core without seismic engineering as a design consideration. The hazard did not increase. The fault did not grow more dangerous. What changed was the stack of human life and infrastructure placed above a loading fault, brick by brick and neighborhood by neighborhood, by a civilization that had been given every reason to believe the danger was purely historical. There is an economic dimension to this that compounds the human one. The central United States is not just where people live, it is the logistics backbone of the entire national economy. The Mississippi River corridor handles more freight tonnage than almost any equivalent stretch of American infrastructure. Memphis is the third largest cargo airport in the world. The Federal Express hub that sorts packages from every city in the country runs through a facility sitting in the direct exposure zone of the new Madrid Seismic Zone. St. Louis is a rail hub. The interstate highway system crosses the Mississippi at multiple points within the projected damage zone, and if those bridges fail, which structural analyses suggest many of them would, the physical connection between the eastern and western United States becomes severely compromised for the duration of the recovery. The fault did not change, the consequences did. Every year that passes without a major event is a year in which more infrastructure, more people, more economic activity accumulates in the same space above a seismic system that has demonstrated, through both geological evidence and historical record, that it breaks catastrophically. The exposure is not hypothetical, it is measured, it is mapped, it is documented in federal modelling that anyone can read. What it is not, somehow, is a part of the national conversation. And to understand why, to really understand the full shape of this problem, we need to go deeper into the science. Because the new Madrid Seismic Zone is not just dangerous, it is scientifically strange in a way that makes it significantly harder to think about, communicate, and prepare for. Part 5. The Intraplate Paradox. Every model of earthquake science that most people carry in their heads, consciously or not, is built around plate tectonics. Earthquakes happen at the edges of tectonic plates. The Pacific Plate grinds against the North American Plate along the San Andreas Fault. The Juan de Fuca Plate dives beneath the Pacific Northwest along the Cascadia Subduction Zone. The Arabian Plate collides with the Eurasian Plate and builds the Zagros Mountains while generating catastrophic earthquakes in Iran and Turkey. Plate boundaries are where the action is. Plate interiors, the stable, ancient cores of continents, are supposed to be quiet. The new Madrid Seismic Zone sits roughly 1,000 miles from the nearest significant tectonic plate boundary. 1,000 miles from where the textbook says the earthquakes are supposed to happen. It is not at an edge. It is not at a collision zone. It is in the absolute interior of the North American Plate, in a part of the continent that has been tectonically stable for hundreds of millions of years by any conventional measure, and yet it generated 3 massive earthquakes in 2 months, in 1811 and 1812, and yet it produces 200 recorded small earthquakes every single year, and yet it appears, from geological evidence we will get to shortly, to have broken catastrophically at least twice more in the past 1500 years. This is what scientists call an intraplate earthquake zone, and it presents one of the most significant unresolved problems in American seismology. How does a fault system 1,000 miles from the nearest plate boundary generate magnitude 7 and magnitude 8 earthquakes? Where does the stress come from? How does it accumulate in a region that GPS measurements suggest is barely moving at all? And that GPS measurement detail is important, because it is where the scientific discomfort becomes palpable. When researchers deploy GPS instruments across California, they measure clear, steady ground motion. The Pacific plate is moving. The stress is building. You can watch it happen in millimeters per year, and the accumulated motion over decades gives you a quantitative basis for estimating how much energy is loading into the system. The models are imperfect, but there is something to measure. When researchers deploy GPS instruments across the New Madrid Seismic Zone, they measure near zero strain accumulation. The ground is barely moving. There is no clear, measurable signal of the kind of stress buildup you would expect to see if a system capable of generating magnitude 7 or magnitude 8 earthquakes was loading toward another one. The instruments are sensitive enough to detect millimeters of motion over years, and what they find in the New Madrid region is something very close to stillness. This creates an extraordinary paradox. The geological record says this fault has broken repeatedly. The historical record says it broke catastrophically 214 years ago. The microseismic data says it is active right now, generating 200 small earthquakes annually. And the GPS data says it is not accumulating strain in any way that the instruments can detect. There are several possible explanations for this, and none of them are fully satisfying. The stress could be accumulating through mechanisms that GPS surface measurements cannot capture. Deep crustal processes, fluid migration, mantle dynamics that operate below the resolution of surface instrumentation. The fault could be loading episodically, spending long periods in an apparent rest state before entering a loading phase that precedes rupture. Or in the most unsettling interpretation, the GPS measurements could be accurate and the fault could be nearing the end of its active cycle, meaning the 1811 to 1812 events may have been the last gasp of a dying seismic system. We will address that last interpretation directly, because it has real policy consequences. But first, let us look at what the geological evidence tells us about where this fault came from, because the origin story of the New Madrid Seismic Zone is one of the stranger chapters in North American geological history. Part 6. The Ancient Scar Hypothesis. Approximately 550 million years ago, before complex life had established itself on the surface of this planet, the North American continent attempted to tear itself apart. A geological process called continental rifting, the same process currently underway in East Africa, the same process that eventually separated North America from Europe and Africa to form the Atlantic Ocean, began pulling the central portion of what would become North America apart along a north-northeast trending axis, running roughly through what is now the Mississippi River Valley. For reasons that geologists are still investigating, the rifting process failed. The continent did not split. The pulling force stopped, or changed direction, or was overcome by other forces. The partially formed rift, called the Reelfoot Rift, was buried by millions of years of subsequent sediment deposition and geological activity. What it left behind was a structural weakness in the crust, a zone where the rock is thinner, where ancient fault surfaces exist at depth, where the mechanical properties of the crust differ from the surrounding intact craton. And in the current stress field of the North American plate, being pushed from the mid-Atlantic ridge to the east and subjected to various compressional forces from the west, those ancient weakness zones are being reactivated. The alignment between the buried Reelfoot Rift and the modern New Madrid Seismic Zone is not coincidental. Modern seismic surveys have imaged the subsurface geology well enough to show that the faults producing today's earthquakes are following the same structural grain laid down by that 550 million-year-old failed rift. The continent is, in a sense, being forced to revisit an ancient wound. This is a compelling hypothesis, and it explains the existence of faulting in an intraplate location reasonably well. But it does not explain the timing or the magnitude. Lots of ancient rift structures exist in the geological record of North America. Very few of them are producing the level of seismic activity observed at New Madrid. The ancient scar tells us where the weakness is. It does not tell us why the weakness is being stressed hard enough to break right now, in this geological moment, rather than remaining dormant the way most ancient rift structures do. That question of mechanism, of what is actually loading the fault, remains the central scientific controversy of New Madrid research, and the competing hypotheses are where the story gets genuinely strange. Part 7. Competing Mechanisms, Unresolved Science. If the ancient scar tells us where the fault is but not why it's active, we need to look elsewhere for the driving mechanism. And what researchers have found is not one answer but several plausible hypotheses, each supported by some evidence, each contradicted by other evidence, and none of them widely agreed upon as a complete explanation. The first hypothesis involves the Laurentide ice sheet, the massive continental glacier that covered most of Canada and the northern United States until roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age. At its maximum extent, the Laurentide ice sheet was up to 3 kilometers thick over portions of its coverage area. 3 kilometers of ice exerts an almost incomprehensible pressure on the crust beneath it. The crust, being a somewhat elastic material on geological timescales, deforms under that weight, pushing downward into the underlying mantle. When the ice melted, that pressure was released. The crust began to rebound, a process called glacial isostatic adjustment, or post-glacial rebound, and that rebound is still happening today, 12,000 years later, because the mantle responds to stress changes on timescales of thousands to tens of thousands of years. The question that some researchers have raised is whether the removal of that enormous ice load could have changed the stress state of faults in the region in ways that make them more susceptible to failure. The Laurentide ice sheet's southern margin extended fairly close to the New Madrid region, and the stress redistribution from its melting could potentially have loaded certain fault orientations in the area. The second hypothesis involves remnants of the Farallon Plate, an ancient oceanic plate that was largely subducted beneath the western edge of North America over the past 100 million years or so. Fragments of this subducted plate may still be present in the mantle beneath parts of the central and eastern United States, sinking slowly deeper into the mantle and exerting gravitational stresses on the overlying crust as they descend. Some researchers have proposed that this ongoing mantle dynamics could be generating the stress loading observed at New Madrid, working through mechanisms that operate at depths far below what surface instruments can directly measure. The third hypothesis focuses on lower crustal weakness zones, the possibility that compositional variations in the deep crust beneath the New Madrid region create mechanical contrasts that concentrate stress along specific fault alignments. Combined with the ancient real-foot rift structure, a zone of compositionally weaker deep crust could serve as a stress concentrator, explaining why seismic activity is focused here rather than diffusely distributed across a broader region. What makes this scientific debate directly relevant to the central concern, the question of whether this fault is dangerous right now, is the timescale problem. Every one of these candidate mechanisms operates over thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. Glacial rebound from the last ice age has been ongoing for 12,000 years, and will continue for thousands more. Farallon plate sinking occurs on similar geological timescales. Lower crustal dynamics are geological processes, not human-scale events. The implication is that the handful of decades covered by modern seismological instrumentation captures only a tiny fraction of the full loading cycle. If the fault loads over timescales of hundreds or thousands of years through mechanisms operating deep in the crust and mantle, then even a century of GPS data showing near zero surface strain is not a meaningful sample of what the system is doing. We're trying to understand a process that operates on geological time by observing it for the equivalent of a single heartbeat. The scientific community does not have consensus on any of this. The mechanisms are actively debated in the peer-reviewed literature. Each competing hypothesis explains some observations and struggles with others, and the lack of consensus is not an academic footnote, it is a direct impediment to predictive modelling, to hazard assessment, to the kind of clear, authoritative scientific communication that drives public policy and individual preparedness decisions. We know it happens, we do not know why. And if you are wondering why that distinction matters for the 10 million people living above this fault, the next section is going to make it very clear. Part 8. The dangerous implication. Let us be very direct about what scientific uncertainty means in a practical context here, because there is a tendency, understandable, human, almost reflexive, to interpret uncertainty as reason for optimism. If scientists are not sure why the fault is active, maybe it is not as active as the historical evidence suggests. If GPS measurements show no clear strain accumulation, maybe the worst-case scenario is unlikely. If the experts are debating, maybe the debate itself means the danger is overstated. That is exactly the wrong conclusion to draw. Uncertainty cuts both ways. If we do not know the mechanism loading the fault, we also do not know when it's close to failure. We cannot build a model that says the fault is currently at 30% capacity, or, based on current strain rates, The next major event is 500 years away. The very ignorance that might feel reassuring is the same ignorance that removes the early warning. Seismologists use a concept sometimes called episodic strain, the idea that some fault systems do not accumulate stress at a steady measurable rate, but instead go through periods of apparent quiescence followed by relatively rapid loading and failure. Under an episodic model, the GPS near silence of the New Madrid region is not evidence of a quiet, de-stressing system. It could be evidence of a system in the low phase of its loading cycle, building toward a threshold that we cannot measure because we are looking for gradual accumulation, and the accumulation is not gradual. Think of it this way. Imagine a pressure valve in a system you cannot fully see. You put instruments on the outside and they tell you the pressure is low, but the instruments only measure the surface, and the pressure is building in a chamber that your instruments cannot reach. The valve looks quiet, it reads quiet, until it does not. The New Madrid fault system may be in exactly that configuration. Quiet at the surface by the metrics we measure, loading in the subsurface by mechanisms we do not fully understand. And there is a concept in the literature sometimes called false stability, the phenomenon by which systems approaching a critical threshold do not signal their proximity through obviously increasing measurable strain, but instead maintain apparent equilibrium until relatively close to failure. What does this mean for the 10 million people above the fault? It means there is no reliable precursor signal to prepare for. It means the first indication that a major event is coming may be the earthquake itself. The California early warning system works because California faults are moving steadily, and the initial P wave of an earthquake can be detected and used to send a seconds-long warning ahead of the slower, more damaging S wave. That warning buys time to stop trains, to duck and cover, to shut off gas systems automatically. A New Madrid major event would arrive with whatever warning the seismic network could provide, which is seconds, not days, not weeks, not the kind of time that changes whether cities have been prepared. This is why the scientific uncertainty is not a reason to wait for clarity. It is precisely the reason to act on the worst-case scenario before clarity arrives. The cost of over-preparing for a risk that turns out to be smaller than feared is measured in money and political will. The cost of under-preparing for a risk that turns out to be exactly what the worst-case models say is measured in the 86,000 fatalities that federal modelling projects. Uncertainty does not reduce risk. It hides it. And a risk that is hidden, from the people living above it, from the institutions responsible for protecting them, from the policymakers who control the resources needed to prepare, is a risk that will arrive without warning into a world that was offered every opportunity to be ready. But here is the thing. Not everyone in the scientific community agrees on the level of that risk. There is a serious, credible, peer-reviewed argument that the New Madrid Seismic Zone may not be the catastrophic threat the worst-case models suggest. And understanding that argument, and understanding what is wrong with it, is essential to understanding why the perception gap is so dangerous. Part 9. The Dying Fault Argument. Not every seismologist looks at the New Madrid data and sees a loaded gun. Some of the most respected researchers in the field look at the same GPS measurements, the same near-zero strain accumulation data, and arrive at a conclusion that is simultaneously more comforting and, if they turn out to be wrong, more catastrophic. Seth Stein, a geophysicist at Northwestern University, has spent years making a careful, evidence-based case that the New Madrid Seismic Zone may be in the process of shutting down. His argument is not fringe science. It is published in leading journals, built on rigorous GPS analysis, and deserves to be taken seriously on its own terms. The core of Stein's argument is this. If the fault were accumulating stress at the rate necessary to generate another major earthquake sequence on a geologically relevant timescale, GPS instruments should be detecting measurable ground motion. The instruments are sensitive. They have been running for decades. And what they consistently show is near zero relative motion across the fault zone, a level of apparent strain accumulation that, in Stein's interpretation, is inconsistent with a fault that is loading toward another catastrophic rupture. His interpretation of the 1811 to 1812 events is that they may represent what he calls a residual event, the release of stress that had been accumulating since a previous geological episode, such as glacial rebound from the last ice age, rather than evidence of an ongoing recurring seismic system. Under this model, The great earthquakes were a response to ancient stress, and that stress is now largely depleted. The fault is not building toward the next event. It is winding down from the last one. If Stein is right, the policy implications are significant. Expensive seismic retrofits of Memphis buildings, strict new building codes, investment in early warning infrastructure, all of this becomes harder to justify if the hazard is substantially lower than the worst-case model suggests. Resources directed at a dying fault are resources not directed elsewhere, and in a world of finite public spending and competing priorities, the dying fault interpretation provides comfortable intellectual cover for the institutional inertia that has kept the central United States from taking this risk seriously. That is exactly why this argument, however carefully constructed, carries a societal danger independent of whether it is scientifically correct. Because when the most reassuring interpretation of uncertain data becomes the default basis for policy, and that interpretation turns out to be wrong, the consequences are not borne by the researchers. They are borne by the people in Memphis who built their lives in unreinforced masonry buildings, on liquefiable soil, reassured by a consensus that chose optimism in the absence of certainty. Let us look at what the evidence that challenges the dying fault argument actually shows. Part 10. The counterargument. The clearest challenge to the dying fault hypothesis comes not from seismometers or GPS instruments, but from the ground itself, specifically from the sediment layers beneath the soil of the lower Mississippi Valley, which have been recording earthquake history for thousands of years in a language that geologists have learned to read. When a major earthquake shakes water-saturated sandy soil, the shaking can cause the sand grains to lose contact with each other and behave temporarily as a fluid. The pressurized water-sand mixture gets forced upward through overlying sediment layers, erupting at the surface in structures called sand blows or sand vents, essentially small volcanic-looking mounds of ejected sand that can be meters across and leave distinctive signatures in the stratigraphic record. These liquefaction features are preserved in the ground long after the earthquake that caused them, and they can be dated. When researchers began systematically mapping and dating paleoseismic evidence across the New Madrid region, looking at sediment cores, excavating soil profiles, dating buried sand blows using radiocarbon and other methods, what they found was not a single anomalous cluster of events around 1811 and 1812. What they found was a repeating pattern. Major earthquake sequences appear to have occurred around 1100 to 1200 CE, roughly 900 years ago. Another cluster of events has been dated to approximately 1400 to 1500 CE, roughly 500 years ago. And then the 1811 to 1812 sequence. The record extended now to approximately 4,500 years of geological observation in some analyses, shows recurring major events with a recurrence interval that various studies have estimated at roughly 500 years, though with considerable uncertainty in the exact timing. 500 years. The last major sequence was 214 years ago. If the paleoseismic record is an accurate guide to recurrence, and if we have not already passed a significant fraction of the interval to the next event, the New Madrid Seismic Zone may not be anywhere near the end of its current cycle. The liquefaction evidence is important for another reason. It is not consistent with a one-time residual stress release event. If the 1811 to 1812 earthquakes were a singular drawdown of ancient glacial rebound stress, you would not expect to see the same pattern of liquefaction, evidence repeating at 500-year intervals, extending back thousands of years. The geological record is telling a story of recurrence, not of terminus. The continuous microseismic activity also weighs against the dying fault interpretation. 200 small earthquakes per year, sustained across decades of instrumental monitoring, is not what a shutting down fault system typically looks like. Systems losing their stress source tend to show declining activity over time. The New Madrid catalogue does not show a clear declining trend. It shows persistent background seismicity at a level that is inconsistent with a fault that has nearly exhausted its stress budget. The majority view among active New Madrid researchers favours ongoing risk. That does not mean every researcher in the field agrees, or that the dying fault hypothesis is without merit. Science does not work by vote. But it does mean that the weight of evidence, the paleoseismic record, the continuous microseismicity, the geological structure of the Reelfoot Rift, points toward a fault system that has broken repeatedly in the past and has no demonstrated reason to have permanently stopped. The path suggests repetition. The instrument suggests silence. The question of which one to believe has consequences that extend far beyond academic debate, and those consequences are already being lived in the policy decisions made and not made across the central United States. Part 11. The hidden risk in the debate. Here is what almost nobody discusses when the dying fault versus ongoing hazard debate is mentioned in public. The debate has already been resolved, in practical terms, by default. Not through scientific consensus, not through explicit policy decisions, but through the simple, uncelebrated accumulation of choices that get made when uncertainty is present and no one is forcing the question. Building codes in Memphis, St. Louis and Nashville are not written to California seismic standards. They have been updated over time, there has been incremental progress, but the inventory of existing buildings, the schools, the hospitals, the apartment complexes built during the low awareness period from 1950 to 1990 has not been systematically retrofitted. The cost is too high. The political will is insufficient. The urgency is not felt because the risk is debated. Earthquake insurance uptake in the central United States is well below 15% of residential properties. Homeowners in Memphis and St. Louis are not choosing to go uninsured because they have carefully evaluated the scientific literature and concluded that the dying fault hypothesis is more credible. They are uninsured because nobody has told them they should be insured, because the insurance is not offered prominently, and because the cognitive architecture of human risk assessment tends strongly toward ignoring low probability, infrequent hazards in the absence of recent personal experience. Public emergency messaging in the region is subdued. The periodic national awareness campaigns around earthquake preparedness focus heavily on the Pacific coast. The Great Central US Shakeout, an annual earthquake preparedness drill organized for the New Madrid region, exists and is valuable, but it does not carry anything close to the cultural weight of California seismic preparedness messaging. Most residents of the exposure zone have never participated in earthquake preparedness of any kind. What has happened, across all of these domains simultaneously, is that the existence of the dying fault debate has been used, not always consciously, not always cynically, but effectively, as permission to do nothing. If credible scientists are uncertain about the hazard level, the argument goes, it would be premature to impose expensive building code requirements or to spend scarce public funds on seismic retrofit programs. Wait for more certainty, wait for the science to resolve. The problem with that logic is that the science may never resolve cleanly. The mechanisms driving New Madrid seismicity may not be understood well enough to produce a definitive probability statement about the next major event within any human planning horizon. Waiting for certainty may mean waiting forever. And every year of waiting is another year in which another school is built to non-seismic standards. Another hospital expands its emergency wing in a building not designed for ground shaking. Another segment of the population reaches adulthood without ever having been taught what to do when the ground moves. The country has already made a choice about the New Madrid Seismic Zone. It has chosen, through inaction, and through the comfortable availability of the dying fault hypothesis, to treat the hazard as manageable at current preparation levels. That choice was never stated explicitly. It was never debated in Congress or decided by any policy body. It accumulated quietly as individual decisions, fiscal choices, and regulatory gaps over decades. And the question that ought to keep anyone up at night is simple. What happens if that choice was wrong? Part 12. What happens if we're wrong? There is a concept in risk management called asymmetric consequence analysis. The idea is straightforward. When evaluating whether to prepare for a potential catastrophe, the relevant question is not simply, how likely is this? But rather, what happens if we prepare and it doesn't occur versus what happens if we don't prepare and it does? The asymmetry in the New Madrid case is almost comically severe. If the dying fault hypothesis is correct and the central United States spends the next 50 years seriously upgrading its seismic preparedness, retrofitting unreinforced masonry buildings, updating hospital construction standards, engineering the Mississippi River bridges to seismic specifications, investing in early warning systems, educating the public, and the fault does not produce a major event in that time, the cost is real. Seismic retrofit programs are expensive. Updating building codes slows construction timelines and raises costs. It is a genuine expenditure of resources that could have been directed elsewhere. But the other side of the ledger, if the ongoing hazard interpretation is correct and the central United States continues on its current trajectory, buildings unretrofitted, bridges uninspected for seismic performance, insurance unpurchased, public unprepared, and the fault produces another major sequence comparable to 1811 and 1812, up to 86,000 people dead, $300 billion in economic damage, 7 million people displaced, requiring emergency housing, food, medical care, and infrastructure repair simultaneously across 5 states. The Mississippi River bridges down, severing the national logistics network. The Federal Express hub at Memphis Airport offline. Natural gas pipelines ruptured across hundreds of miles. Hospitals damaged in the cities where the injured most need care. The Federal Emergency Management Agency's modelling of this scenario, the agency does not use the word catastrophic casually, describes it as a potentially decades-long recovery. Not years, decades. The comparison point that FEMA planners most commonly reach for is not Katrina or Andrew or any other American natural disaster. The comparison is the reconstruction of entire cities. There is no rational argument, from a pure expected value standpoint, for the level of underpreparation currently present in the new Madrid exposure zone. The potential downside of inadequate preparation is so catastrophically larger than the potential downside of over-preparation that the asymmetry alone should compel action, independent of where exactly one comes down on the ongoing versus dying fault debate. And yet the preparation gap persists. The buildings remain unretrofitted, the bridges remain uninspected, the public remains uninformed, and to understand why, really understand why, in a way that goes beyond simply blaming inertia or ignorance, we need to look at the infrastructure that is most exposed, the specific physical vulnerabilities that make this scenario so severe, and the behavioural and institutional forces that have made addressing those vulnerabilities so difficult. This is a gamble with asymmetric consequences, and America is currently on the losing side of it. Part 13, the Building Code Blind Spot. If you want to understand the physical vulnerability of the new Madrid exposure zone in concrete terms, start with a building type that earthquake engineers describe using a phrase that sounds almost quaint until you understand what it means in a magnitude 7 or magnitude 8 event: unreinforced masonry. Unreinforced masonry means brick construction, the kind of beautiful, durable-looking older buildings that line the main streets of Memphis, the historic districts of St. Louis, the downtowns of dozens of smaller cities throughout the new Madrid zone. These buildings were constructed with brick walls that carry the load of the floors and roof. There is no internal steel frame, there is no engineered connection between the floors and the walls. The structural integrity of the building depends on the static weight of gravity, holding everything together. Under seismic shaking, this is a catastrophic design. The horizontal forces generated by earthquake motion are the forces that unreinforced masonry resists most poorly. The walls, unable to flex, crack and fail. The floors, not connected to the walls, begin to move independently. The roof loses its support. Unreinforced masonry buildings do not gently deform and sustain repairable damage in a major earthquake. They collapse. Engineers call them brittle failure structures. When they go completely and they go fast. California recognized this in the aftermath of earthquakes earlier in the 20th century. The 1933 Long Beach earthquake, which killed 115 people, was so lethal partly because of school buildings constructed in unreinforced masonry. California enacted the Field Act immediately afterward, prohibiting unreinforced masonry construction for schools. Further legislation and earthquake events drove increasingly strict building codes, mandatory retrofit programs, and a systematic effort to identify and either strengthen or demolish the most vulnerable structures. The central United States did none of this. Why would it? The last major earthquake anyone remembered was a historical event from before living memory, described in frontier accounts that sounded more like legend than practical warning. The building tradition in the region was masonry. It looked permanent, it was affordable, it was what was built. The decades from 1950 through 1990, when the population of the new Madrid zone grew most rapidly and the majority of the current building stock was constructed, passed without a seismic event large enough to change the conversation. Today, the inventory of unreinforced masonry buildings in Memphis alone runs into the thousands. Schools, hospitals, apartment buildings, commercial structures. Many of them are older, beloved, architecturally significant buildings that communities have no immediate desire to demolish or replace. Some have been partially retrofitted, most have not. And in the residential sector, the conversation about seismic vulnerability has barely begun. Seismic building codes in the central United States have improved, particularly since the 1990s when the New Madrid hazard began to receive more serious regulatory attention. New construction in the region is generally built to better standards than the pre-existing stock, but new construction is a small fraction of what will be standing when the next major event occurs. The danger is built into the walls of the buildings that were already there, the ones that are too expensive to replace but too dangerous to ignore, and which have been ignored anyway because the seismic risk has not been sufficiently real in the public consciousness to generate the political will for mandatory retrofit programs. The danger is built into the walls, and the walls are everywhere. Part 14. The Structural Weakness Map. The vulnerability of the New Madrid exposure zone is not evenly distributed. Earthquake damage follows patterns, the quality of construction, the type of soil, the age of the buildings, the proximity to river systems. And when you map those patterns across the exposure zone, certain areas stand out as places where a major event would be most immediately devastating. Memphis sits on what geologists call alluvial deposits, the deep, water-saturated, sandy and silty soils laid down over thousands of years by the Mississippi River and its tributaries. These soils are among the worst possible for earthquake performance. Under strong shaking, they liquefy. The phenomenon, which we have already discussed in the context of the 1811 to 1812 events, is well understood scientifically and catastrophically underappreciated in terms of its practical implications for urban infrastructure. When soil liquefies beneath a building, the building does not just shake. The foundation loses its support. Structures can sink, tilt, or tip entirely. Buried pipelines can float upward as the surrounding soil loses density. Bridge foundations can shift. Road surfaces can crack and buckle as the soil beneath them moves in ways that solid ground never would. The specific soil conditions of Memphis, the depth of the alluvial deposits, the water table elevation, the grain-size distribution of the sandy layers, make much of the city's footprint highly susceptible to liquefaction in a major New Madrid event. St. Louis presents a different but equally concerning vulnerability profile. The city has a substantial inventory of older brick buildings concentrated in its historic commercial and residential districts. The urban core was built primarily in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, well before modern seismic codes, in a style that relied heavily on unreinforced masonry construction. The Mississippi River waterfront areas of St. Louis also include significant zones of potentially liquefiable soil, and the city's river bridges, some of which were built decades ago, have received varying levels of seismic evaluation and upgrading. Nashville, while not in the immediate epicentral zone, sits within the range of damaging shaking under a major New Madrid event due to the craton propagation physics discussed earlier. Nashville has grown dramatically in recent decades, and its newer construction is generally better than what Memphis and St. Louis built in the mid-20th century. But the older stock remains, and the population's awareness of earthquake risk is, if anything, even lower than in cities closer to the fault, because the distance from New Madrid provides a false sense of insulation that the physics does not actually support. The smaller cities in the zone, Paducah, Kentucky, Cape Girardeau, Missouri, Jonesboro, Arkansas, Jackson, Tennessee, are in some ways more concerning than the major metros. They are closer to the fault in several cases, they have even fewer resources for emergency response, and their building stock is often even older and less maintained than in the larger cities. They receive even less attention in the rare public discussions of New Madrid preparedness. And in a multi-state disaster event, they are exactly the communities that would fall through the gaps of a response system, overwhelmed by simultaneous crises across hundreds of miles. The risk is not evenly distributed. Some places are built to fail first, and the people living in those places, sitting in those buildings, driving over those bridges, deserve to know it. Part 15. Insurance and Behavioural Reality. Less than 15% of homeowners in the New Madrid exposure zone carry earthquake insurance. In California, despite all the cultural awareness, the building code advances, and the decades of public preparedness messaging, earthquake insurance uptake is still not universal. But in the central United States, the gap is even more extreme. and the consequences of that gap for the recovery from a major event would be severe. When a natural disaster destroys a home in a region with high insurance coverage, the insurance payment allows the homeowner to rebuild or relocate. The reconstruction process, while painful, is funded. When a natural disaster destroys a home in a region with minimal insurance coverage, the homeowner faces a choice between federal disaster assistance, which is limited, slow, and rarely covers the full replacement cost and financial ruin. Multiply that across hundreds of thousands of homes simultaneously, and you have not just a physical recovery problem but a financial one that would keep the region economically depressed for a generation. The reason earthquake insurance uptake is so low in the region is not primarily cost, though the cost of earthquake insurance in the central United States is not trivial. It is perception. Homeowners purchase insurance for risks they believe are real and proximate. Flood insurance uptake in the Gulf Coast region is high because residents have experienced flooding and understand it as a genuine threat. Tornado coverage in the Midwest and South is standard because tornadoes happen regularly, within the living memory of almost everyone in those regions. Earthquake insurance in the New Madrid Zone is purchased almost exclusively by homeowners who have specifically sought out information about their seismic exposure, a small, self-selected group. The vast majority of residents have never been meaningfully informed of the risk, have never experienced a damaging earthquake, and have no behavioural or emotional framework that would prompt them to add earthquake coverage to their homeowner's policy. This financial unpreparedness is not a separate problem from the physical unpreparedness of the building stock or the behavioural unpreparedness of the population. They are all expressions of the same underlying failure. The knowledge that the scientific and federal emergency management communities hold about this risk has not been translated into the individual and institutional choices that would actually reduce the consequences when the fault moves. Part 16. The Infrastructure Domino Effect. Stand at the Hernando de Soto Bridge in Memphis, the cable-stayed bridge carrying Interstate 40 across the Mississippi, and look north toward the older Harahan Railroad Bridge. In two directions, you're looking at structures that represent something far more significant than a local crossing. You're looking at choke points in the national supply chain, points of physical connection between the eastern and western United States, structural assets whose simultaneous failure in a major earthquake event would create cascading consequences reaching every corner of the American economy within days. The Mississippi River is not just a geographical feature. It is a logistics corridor of extraordinary national importance. The barge system operating on the Mississippi and its navigable tributaries moves more agricultural commodities, grain, soybeans, fertilizers, than any equivalent transportation network in the country. A significant fraction of American agricultural exports move through Memphis and the lower river corridor on their way to Gulf Coast ports. If the river is blocked by bridge failures, by debris from collapsed banks, by subsidence of navigation infrastructure, that flow stops. The stoppage is not a regional inconvenience, it is a disruption to global commodity markets. The natural gas pipeline network running through the New Madrid Zone serves a substantial portion of the eastern United States. These pipelines were routed through the Mississippi Valley because that is where the terrain allows efficient routing and where the population centres they serve are concentrated. In a major seismic event, buried pipelines crossing active fault zones or running through liquefiable soils are vulnerable to rupture at multiple points simultaneously. Natural gas is not just a heating fuel. It powers a significant fraction of the electrical generation capacity in the eastern grid. Disrupting the pipeline network disrupts electricity generation across a region far beyond the immediate earthquake zone. The electrical grid itself is interconnected in ways that make it vulnerable to cascading failure. Transmission towers built on liquefiable soil near the river can fail. High-voltage transmission lines crossing the Mississippi at bridge structures can be severed when those structures fail. The eastern interconnection, the power grid that covers most of the eastern United States, is designed with resilience against individual component failures, but the simultaneous loss of multiple generation sources, transmission corridors, and distribution infrastructure across a multi-state zone may exceed the redundancy built into the system. Interstate highways cross the Mississippi at multiple points within the damage zone. Interstate 55, Interstate 40, Interstate 57, Interstate 64. These corridors carry the vast majority of road freight moving between the eastern and western United States through this part of the country. When the bridges fail, and the structural analyses of bridge performance under major New Madrid shaking suggest that many of the river crossings in the zone would sustain significant damage. The roadway network is severed at its most critical junctures, and here is the concept that emergency planners call cascading failure. Each one of these infrastructure disruptions, the river blocked, the pipelines ruptured, the electrical grid destabilized, the highway bridges down, would be a major regional crisis on its own. Combined, simultaneous, hitting an already overwhelmed emergency response system, they create a failure cascade that amplifies rather than simply adds. The gas pipelines that rupture start fires. The fires cannot be fought because the water pressure system depends on electric pumps that depend on a grid that just failed. The hospitals that lost power cannot treat the patients arriving from collapsed buildings. The trucks that could deliver fuel and food cannot cross the river because the bridges are down. The National Guard units mobilizing in Tennessee and Missouri cannot share resources because the coordinating communications infrastructure is offline. The fault does not just break ground, it breaks systems. And those systems, in the central United States, have never been designed with the understanding that the ground might break first. Part 17. The Awareness Gap. Researchers at St. Louis University and other institutions in the New Madrid exposure zone have periodically surveyed residents of the region about their awareness of the seismic hazard. The results are, by this point in our story, predictable but no less remarkable for being so. Across multiple studies, conducted at different times and in different cities within the exposure zone, the majority of respondents did not know they lived in a seismic zone. Many residents of Memphis were unaware that their city had any meaningful earthquake risk. Residents of cities closer to the fault center, places like New Madrid, Missouri itself, showed somewhat higher awareness simply due to the geographic identity the name provides, but even there, the practical preparedness behaviors that awareness is supposed to motivate, securing heavy furniture, storing water and emergency supplies, identifying structurally safe areas in the home, were largely absent. This is genuinely strange when you think about what information is available. The United States Geological Survey publishes its hazard maps publicly and freely. The Federal Emergency Management Agency has produced detailed scenario documents describing a major New Madrid event. Academic researchers have published widely in accessible formats. The National Earthquake Hazards Reduction Program has materials specifically designed for public education. The information exists, it is not hidden. The question is why it has failed so completely to penetrate the awareness of the population most directly at risk. Part of the answer is a concept that risk communication researchers sometimes call risk without narrative. Most hazards that generate strong public awareness are connected to vivid, personal, recent stories. People in coastal Florida know about hurricanes because they or someone they know has experienced a hurricane. The storm has a name, a date, a track they can follow on the news for days before it arrives. It is embedded in local culture, in insurance requirements, in building codes that are visible to anyone constructing a home in the region. The New Madrid Seismic Zone has no recent narrative. The last major event was 214 years ago. There is no one alive who felt it. The only living memory of damaging New Madrid earthquakes involves events in the low magnitude 5 range that cracked plaster and knocked objects off shelves, alarming to those who experienced them, but nowhere near the scale that creates lasting behavioural change. The hazard exists in textbooks and federal documents, not in the lived experience or oral tradition of the people it threatens. You cannot prepare for what you do not believe. And most residents of the New Madrid exposure zone do not believe, in any operationally useful sense, that the ground beneath them is dangerous. The information is available, the belief is not formed, and that gap between available knowledge and internalised belief is where the real danger lives. Part 18. Why the risk feels unreal. Human beings are remarkably poor at assessing risks that they have never personally experienced. This is not a character flaw, it is a feature of how the human perceptual and cognitive system was built. For most of human evolutionary history, the most important risks were immediate, visible, and recent. The predator you saw yesterday, the flood that hit last season, the rival group that attacked 3 years ago. These were the risks that shaped human psychology, and the brain became very good at responding to them. The New Madrid Seismic Zone does not register in this ancient risk assessment architecture. The last catastrophic event was before the living memory of anyone on Earth. The recurrence interval, whatever it actually is is measured in centuries, not years. There is no visible fault trace to see, no mountain range rising to remind you that the ground is stressed, no annual season of elevated risk the way hurricane season creates a recurring moment of alertness along the Gulf Coast. Psychologists who study how people process low-probability, high-consequence risks have identified a specific mechanism called temporal discounting, the tendency to assign less weight to outcomes that are distant in time. A threat that might materialize in 5 years feels less urgent than a threat that might materialize in 5 months, even if the eventual consequences are identical. A threat whose recurrence interval is measured in centuries barely registers as a practical concern at all, regardless of what the consequence projections say. Add to this the absence of a visible fault line. California's seismic awareness is reinforced in part by the physical geography of the state. The transverse ranges, the coast ranges, the Salton Sea, these are visible consequences of plate tectonics, reminders etched into the landscape that the ground here has been moving and will move again. Memphis sits in a flat river valley. The visible geography gives no indication of what lies beneath. There is no physical anchor for the mental model that the ground is dangerous. The combination of long recurrence interval, no recent personal experience, no visible fault expression, and the general human tendency to prefer the most optimistic available interpretation of uncertain data creates what risk researchers call a dread gap. Not the dread that motivates preparedness, but the absence of dread that leaves populations unprepared for events that the technical record clearly shows are possible, probable, and historically recurring. There is also a specific cognitive mechanism worth naming here, because it operates at the institutional level as well as the individual one. When people are presented with a risk that would require substantial behavioural change to address, the mind has a tendency to find reasons to discount the risk, rather than incur the cost of changing. This is not simple denial. It is a motivated reasoning process that selects from the available interpretations of uncertain data the ones that require the least costly response. The dying fault hypothesis, whatever its scientific merits, fits this cognitive pattern almost perfectly. It provides a scientifically legitimate framing for the conclusion that no expensive action is necessary. The brain rejects what it cannot imagine, and 214 years of silence has made the new Madrid Seismic Zone almost impossible to imagine for individuals and for the institutions that serve them. Part 19. Institutional inertia. If the awareness gap and the psychology of risk discounting explain why individual residents of the exposure zone have not demanded action, the behaviour of government institutions requires a somewhat different explanation, though the two are deeply connected. Elected officials respond to constituent priorities. If constituents are not asking about earthquake preparedness, if earthquake risk does not show up in polling data as a concern, if no recent event has made seismic vulnerability a political issue, then allocating scarce public resources to seismic retrofit programs is a politically unrewarding decision. The benefits are diffuse, future, and conditional. The costs are immediate, concentrated in specific industries and property owners, and certain. The political calculus is unfavourable. The cost of a serious seismic retrofit program for the most vulnerable buildings in the New Madrid zone would be in the hundreds of billions of dollars. That figure is not an exaggeration, and not a reason to dismiss the effort. It is simply the scale of the problem that was created over the decades of under-regulated construction in a recognised hazard zone. Retrofitting unreinforced masonry buildings to acceptable seismic performance standards requires either comprehensive steel framing additions or, in many cases, demolition and replacement. Neither option is cheap. Neither option is politically easy. Both options are far cheaper than the post-disaster recovery the FEMA Models project. State and local governments in the region have, over the years, made incremental improvements. Seismic provisions in building codes have been updated, a few retrofit programs have been funded, earthquake preparedness curricula have been introduced in some school districts. But the pace of these improvements has been measured in decades, not years, and the gap between the current state of preparation and the minimum level needed to meaningfully reduce the worst-case casualties remains enormous. The institutional response has been slow, not because the people in those institutions are negligent, but because the incentive structures, the resource constraints, and the political environment have consistently rewarded inaction. The systemic delay does not prove that the risk is negligible. It proves that risk without a recent catastrophe attached to it struggles to compete with the daily pressures of governance for a political system built on short electoral cycles and immediate constituent demands. And this delay reinforces the illusion. Every year that passes without a major event is a year in which the implicit institutional message to the public is that the risk is not serious enough to warrant emergency action. The absence of urgency becomes its own form of communication. The population looks to its institutions for signals about how scared to be, and the institutions, through their inaction, have been signalling for decades, not very. Part 20. Not a cover-up, something worse. Let us address something directly, because it comes up whenever this subject reaches a wider audience. There are people who frame the new Madrid preparedness gap as evidence of a government cover-up, a deliberate suppression of information to avoid economic disruption, to prevent real estate market crashes, to keep the population calm. That interpretation is both more dramatic and less disturbing than the reality. The Federal Emergency Management Agency publishes its catastrophic New Madrid scenario documents publicly. The United States Geological Survey maintains its hazard maps, publishes its research, and communicates seismic risk through multiple public channels. The Center for Earthquake Research and Information at the University of Memphis is not a secret organization. Its earthquake catalogues, hazard assessments, and educational materials are freely available to anyone with internet access. Congressional testimony on New Madrid risk has been presented openly. Academic journals have published hundreds of peer-reviewed papers on every aspect of the seismic hazard. There is no cover-up. The information is accessible. It has been accessible for decades. What there is instead is something that researchers in risk communication call passive transparency, the condition in which information is technically available but not actively communicated in ways that reach and persuade the populations most at risk. Passive transparency is, in many ways, worse than a cover-up. A cover-up implies agency and intention, someone making a decision to suppress information. Passive transparency implies the absence of agency. Nobody is suppressing the New Madrid research. Nobody is deciding that Memphis residents should be kept ignorant. The information simply sits in federal documents and academic journals, available to anyone who seeks it out, unreached by the vast majority of the people it most concerns. The risk persists not because it is hidden, but because it is ignored, and that distinction matters enormously for what would need to change. You can expose a cover-up. You cannot expose a passive failure of communication in the same way. You have to build something new messaging, new public education, new institutional incentives, new cultural narratives that make the risk feel real and proximate, in the way that hurricanes feel real and proximate to residents of coastal Louisiana. That building has not happened. And as we turn now to what the next major New Madrid event would actually look like, in concrete, human terms, under modern conditions, it becomes clear why the time to start building it is not after the event, it is right now. Part 21. What a repeat looks like today. Let us walk through it. Not as an abstract scenario in a FEMA planning document, but as a sequence of events unfolding across hours, days, and weeks, because the full consequences of a major New Madrid event under 21st century conditions are only visible when you follow the cascade all the way through. It is early morning in Memphis. The sequence begins, as the 1811 to 1812 sequence began, not with a single large earthquake, but with a foreshock, a magnitude 5 or 5.5 event at approximately 3 in the morning, felt across the region, interpreted initially as a significant but not catastrophic earthquake. Emergency managers activate their notification systems. Local media begins covering the event. Residents wake up, check social media, go back to bed. 6 hours later, the main shock arrives, magnitude 7.7. The ground beneath Memphis, sitting on deep alluvial deposits, amplifies the shaking. What would be damaging motion on bedrock becomes catastrophic shaking on the water-saturated soils of the river valley. The shaking lasts for 30 to 45 seconds, not the 2 or 3 seconds that feels long in a moderate California earthquake, but a duration that is long enough to take nearly every unreinforced masonry building in the downtown beyond its failure threshold. The collapses begin within the first 10 seconds. Buildings that have stood for 100 years, that looked permanent and solid and characteristic of their neighbourhoods, fail suddenly and completely. Brick walls shear outward, floors pancake, The distinctive failure mode of unreinforced masonry, catastrophic, total, immediate, plays out simultaneously across thousands of structures. In the older residential neighborhoods south and east of downtown Memphis, where block after block of brick construction was built in the 1910s through 1940s, whole streets disappear under rubble. Simultaneously, across the alluvial lowlands closer to the river, the soil begins to liquefy. The process is rapid under the intensity of shaking. Sand erupts from the ground in dozens of locations. Building foundations lose their support. Structures that survived the initial shaking begin to lean, to sink, to tilt. Streets that were intact at the beginning of the event are unnavigable by the end. The surfaces of major roadways crack and buckle as the soil beneath them moves in ways that the pavement was never designed to accommodate. At the Mississippi River crossings, the situation is critical. Bridge foundations anchored in liquefiable soils experience loss of bearing capacity. The cables and deck structures of the major crossings are designed for wind and live load, with seismic provisions that were current when the bridges were built, but which are not uniformly adequate for the maximum credible New Madrid event. Several crossings sustain damage sufficient to close them to traffic. At least one major crossing, the analysis varies by which bridge and which scenario assumptions, is projected by engineering studies to fail completely. The river is severed. By the time the main shock is over, approximately 45 seconds after it began, the physical world has changed. In Memphis and the surrounding region, tens of thousands of people are trapped in collapsed buildings, injured in the street, or isolated in structures that are standing but severely damaged. The hospital system, several facilities of which are housed in buildings not designed to current seismic standards, is simultaneously overwhelmed and compromised. Patients inside are in danger. Patients who need care from collapsing buildings cannot be received effectively. The fires start within hours. Natural gas lines beneath the streets have been ruptured at hundreds of points across the city. The ignitions are nearly simultaneous, spread across an area too large for any fire department to address. The water system, whose underground pipes have been cracked and broken by the shaking, cannot provide the pressure needed to fight the fires. The fires that began in the first hours after the 1906 San Francisco earthquake killed more people and destroyed more property than the earthquake itself. Memphis, with a more extensive gas distribution network than San Francisco had in 1906, faces the same dynamic with even less capacity to respond. In St. Louis, 250 miles to the north, the shaking has been strong enough to damage older structures, to crack building facades, to trigger multiple partial collapses in the historic masonry districts. No catastrophic failures at the scale of Memphis, but dozens of buildings requiring immediate evacuation, dozens more with structural damage that will only be revealed in the weeks of inspection that follow. The river bridges at St. Louis sustained damage. Several are closed pending inspection. The transportation network through the city is severely disrupted. In Nashville, the shaking is significant, but not catastrophic for well-constructed modern buildings. However, the older stock, the unreinforced masonry schools, the mid-century commercial buildings, the historic residential neighborhoods, sustains meaningful damage. Hospitals report non-structural damage, equipment displaced, ceilings fallen. The demand for medical resources is growing precisely as the road network that would normally bring supplies from the east becomes unreliable. The displacement begins immediately. Tens of thousands of households whose buildings have been damaged or destroyed have nowhere to go. Hotels fill within hours. The highway system, damaged, partially severed at the river crossings, overwhelmed by evacuating traffic, begins to fail as a logistics infrastructure. People moving away from the disaster zone compete for road space with emergency vehicles moving toward it. The interstate highway system, Interstate 40, Interstate 55, the Great East-West and North-South corridors that were designed for ordinary commerce, was never designed to serve simultaneously as an evacuation route, an emergency response corridor, and a supply chain for 5 million people who have just lost basic services. Within 48 hours, the scale of the event has exceeded the capacity of any single federal response framework. Every protocol that Federal Emergency Management Agency planners developed for this scenario is being activated, and every protocol is revealing its inadequacy for the actual scope of simultaneous need. The agency was designed to amplify state and local response. The state and local response across 5 states is not a foundation to amplify. It is itself overwhelmed, under-resourced, and in many cases physically inaccessible, 7 million people displaced. The figure, sitting in that FEMA document in clean bureaucratic language, does not convey what 7 million displaced people looks like on the ground. It looks like every shelter in 5 states full within the first day. It looks like families in cars on highways that are no longer moving. It looks like children separated from parents in the chaos of building evacuations. It looks like elderly residents unable to leave damaged structures because no transportation is available, and no one has yet reached them. It looks like the entire social infrastructure of the central United States operating at a fraction of its capacity, while facing many times its normal load. And the second main shock arrives, because the 1811 to 1812 sequence was not a single event, it was a sequence. The January 23rd event followed the December 16th event by 38 days. The February 7th event followed the January event by 15 days. Modern seismological understanding of the New Madrid fault system does not rule out a multi-event sequence of similar structure. Emergency managers who survive the first main shock must conduct their operations under the assumption that another major event may follow, the same fault, completely different consequences. Part 22. Trigger speculation. One of the more unsettling areas of current research involves the question of what might trigger a New Madrid event, not in the deep, multi-millennial sense of what loads the fault, but in the more immediate sense of what final push might bring a critically stressed fault to failure. And when you start pulling on that thread, you realise the answer is not one thing. It is several things, some of them natural, some of them human, all of them outside our ability to predict or control, and that combination, multiple potential triggers, none of them monitorable with sufficient precision, is what keeps the researchers who study this zone up at night in a way that the general public simply has not been invited to share. Let us start with the one that feels most like science fiction, but is thoroughly documented in the peer-reviewed literature. A phenomenon called dynamic triggering has been studied seriously in seismology for the past 3 decades, and what it describes should genuinely recalibrate how you think about earthquakes as isolated, local events. When a large earthquake occurs anywhere on the planet, it does not simply shake the ground near its epicenter and stop. The seismic waves it generates travel outward in all directions, crossing oceans, passing through continental interiors, circling the globe multiple times before their energy finally dissipates. And as those waves pass through distant fault zones, they can, under the right conditions, trigger earthquakes in those zones. Not metaphorically, physically. The passing wave delivers a pulse of stress to a fault that was already close to its failure threshold, and that pulse is enough to push it over. This is not theoretical. The 1992 Landers earthquake in the Mojave Desert of California triggered a measurable increase in small earthquake activity across geothermal and volcanic areas of the western United States, some of them more than 1,000 miles from the epicenter. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan, the magnitude 9 event that generated the devastating tsunami, was subsequently associated with triggering effects that researchers detected across multiple continents in the hours and days following the main shock. The seismic waves from that single event in the Pacific Ocean passed through fault zones in South America, in Central America, in the western United States, and in each case researchers documented elevated microseismic activity in the hours after those waves arrived. Here is the part that is directly relevant to New Madrid. Researchers have documented dynamic triggering within the New Madrid Seismic Zone itself following distant major earthquakes. The zone responded. The microseismic catalogue shows the signature, which means the New Madrid fault system is not isolated from global seismic activity in the way that a purely local static stress model might suggest. It is connected to it, coupled to the global seismic system in ways that are real and measurable, even if their ultimate significance for major rupture timing remains uncertain. What the science cannot currently resolve is the critical question. Could dynamic triggering push a New Madrid fault that is close to failure all the way to a major rupture? The honest answer is that nobody knows. If the fault is sufficiently close to its failure threshold, if it has accumulated enough stress through whatever deep mechanism is loading it, then a passing seismic wave from a large earthquake on the opposite side of the planet could theoretically deliver the final increment of stress needed to initiate rupture, a magnitude 8 in Chile, a magnitude 9 in the Pacific. a great earthquake anywhere on the global seismic belt, sending waves radiating outward across the planet, passing beneath Missouri and Tennessee and providing the last push that a critically loaded fault was waiting for. This is not a prediction. Let me be very clear about that. Nobody is saying that the next large earthquake in Japan will trigger New Madrid. The science cannot make that claim, and I am not making it either. What I am saying, what the science is saying, is that this is a physical possibility that the current state of knowledge cannot exclude, and a possibility that cannot be excluded, involving a fault with the consequence profile of New Madrid, is a possibility that deserves to be taken seriously. The second potential trigger mechanism is quieter, more seasonal, and in some ways more strange because of how ordinary it sounds. The Mississippi River is one of the largest river systems in the world, draining roughly 40% of the continental United States. The volume of water moving through that system varies enormously with the seasons and with precipitation patterns. In high water years during spring floods, the weight of water in the river channel and its surrounding floodplain is measured in hundreds of billions of tons. In drought years, that weight drops substantially. That fluctuation, hundreds of billions of tons of water loading and unloading onto the crust of the Earth on an annual cycle, exerts a real, measurable, changing stress on the underlying geology. Some researchers have noted correlations between seasonal river level variations and microseismicity patterns in the New Madrid zone. When the river is high, certain fault orientations may be loaded in ways that promote slip. When it is low, the stress configuration changes. The relationship is not simple or perfectly linear, and the research is ongoing, but the signal is there in the data. The Earth beneath the Mississippi Valley is responding, at least at the microseismic level, to the weight of the water above it changing with the seasons. Whether this seasonal hydrological loading is sufficient to influence the timing of a major rupture is genuinely unknown. What it establishes is that the New Madrid fault system is sensitive to surface loading changes at a level that is detectable by instruments, and if it is sensitive to the natural seasonal cycle of the river, the question of whether larger, more abrupt hydrological changes, a catastrophic flood, a sustained multi-year drought followed by sudden recharge, could have more significant effects is one the science has not closed. Then there is the trigger mechanism that is entirely human in origin. Induced seismicity, earthquakes caused by human industrial activities, went from a fringe concern to a mainstream seismological issue in the space of about a decade, driven primarily by the dramatic increase in wastewater disposal operations associated with the oil and gas boom in the central United States. When wastewater from oil and gas extraction is injected into deep disposal wells, it can migrate into fault zones and reduce the frictional resistance that keeps those faults locked. The result is earthquakes. Oklahoma went from experiencing 1 or 2 magnitude 3 or larger earthquakes per year historically to experiencing several hundred per year at the peak of its induced seismicity period in the middle 2010s. The connection between injection operations and earthquake activity in Oklahoma was so clear that state regulators eventually imposed disposal volume restrictions, and the seismicity rate subsequently declined. The direct connection between wastewater injection operations and the New Madrid fault system specifically has not been established with the same clarity as the Oklahoma case. The geology is different, the operational patterns are different, and the research is less developed. But the broader principle that human industrial activities can change the stress state of crustal faults in ways that alter their seismic behaviour is no longer scientifically contested, it is established. And the central United States, with its extensive history of oil and gas operations, its deep injection wells, and its complex subsurface geology, is not a region where the possibility of human-induced stress changes to the fault system can be casually dismissed. What ties all three of these trigger mechanisms together, dynamic triggering from distant earthquakes, seasonal hydrological loading from the river system, induced stress changes from industrial operations, is the same conclusion, and it is one that has profound implications for how we think about preparedness. Each of these mechanisms operates outside our ability to prevent, predict, with precision, or time with any useful advance notice. We cannot stop large earthquakes from happening in Chile or Japan. We cannot drain the Mississippi River to prevent seasonal loading cycles. We cannot retroactively uninject the wastewater that has already been disposed of in wells across the region. What this means, practically, is that there is no trigger-watching strategy that gives us the warning time we would need to prepare after the fact. There is no monitoring approach, no matter how sophisticated, that will give us weeks or months of notice that a triggering event is about to push the New Madrid system to failure. The warning, if it comes at all, will be measured in the seconds that a seismic early warning system can buy between the detection of the initial P wave and the arrival of the damaging S wave. The unpredictability of triggers is not a reason to look away from this story. It is the central reason to look directly at it. A fault with multiple potential trigger mechanisms, none of them controllable, none of them predictable with useful precision, is a fault that rewards only one rational response: preparation that is already in place before any trigger ever fires. Not preparation we build after the warning, preparation we build now, while the ground is still. The unpredictability is not an argument for fatalism. It is the strongest possible argument for treating every day of geological quiet as the preparation window it actually is. Part 23. Global Context. It is worth pausing briefly to note that the preparedness gap at New Madrid is not a law of nature, it is a choice. And we can see what the alternative looks like, because other societies, facing geological threats as serious or more serious than anything the New Madrid Seismic Zone can deliver, made a different choice. They looked at the science, accepted what it told them, and built their institutions, their buildings, their cultures, and their daily habits around the reality that the ground beneath them was not permanently stable. The result is not perfect safety. No level of preparation eliminates seismic risk entirely, but it is a measurably, dramatically different outcome than what the current trajectory in the central United States points toward. Japan is the place to start, because Japan is the most instructive example on the planet of what it looks like when a society decides, collectively and at every institutional level, to take earthquake risks seriously. Japan sits at the convergence of four tectonic plates: the Pacific Plate, the Philippine Sea Plate, the Eurasian Plate, and the North American Plate, all meet in and around the Japanese archipelago, creating one of the most geologically violent environments that human civilization has chosen to inhabit. Japan does not have a New Madrid problem. Japan has a problem that makes New Madrid look manageable: repeated, large, inevitable earthquakes, occurring with a frequency that gives the population no opportunity to forget that the ground is dangerous. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami is the event most people reference when they think about Japanese seismic vulnerability. Magnitude 9.0, the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in Japan. A tsunami that swept 10 to 40 meters inland across hundreds of kilometers of Pacific coastline, destroying entire coastal communities in minutes. Nearly 16,000 people died. It was a catastrophe by any measure, a human tragedy of a scale that is genuinely difficult to absorb. And yet, the death toll from the 2011 Tohoku event, devastating as it was, represents the performance of a prepared society, facing a geological event at the outer boundary of what the planet can produce. Researchers who modelled the Tohoku scenario under different preparedness assumptions, using the building stock and emergency response capacity of a less prepared country as the comparison, have estimated that the same earthquake and tsunami hitting an unprepared equivalent society could have killed several times as many people. The preparation Japan had built over decades did not prevent the disaster. It compressed the consequences. It is the difference between 16,000 dead and potentially 60,000 dead. That difference has names attached to it. Those are real people who went home. Japanese children practice earthquake drills from kindergarten, not once a year as a formality, not as a box-checking exercise in the school calendar, but as a practiced, repeated, physically rehearsed response that becomes as automatic as any other learned behaviour. By the time a Japanese child reaches adulthood, they have practiced dropping, covering and holding on dozens of times. They know which parts of their home are structurally safer than others. They know where the family emergency kit is. They know the evacuation route from their neighbourhood. This knowledge is not academic. It is embodied. It is the kind of knowledge that functions under the cognitive disruption of actual emergency conditions, when abstract information often fails and only practiced behaviour survives. Japanese buildings are engineered to seismic standards that represent decades of hard-won lessons from real earthquakes. After the 1995 Kobe earthquake, which killed over 6,000 people, and revealed significant vulnerabilities in older building stock, Japan undertook a systematic national retrofit and replacement program targeting structures that did not meet post-1981 seismic codes. The program was expensive, it was politically difficult, it took years, and it changed the structural landscape of Japanese cities in ways that directly saved lives in subsequent earthquakes. The average commercial building in central Memphis, by comparison, was not designed to any meaningful seismic standard and has not been evaluated for seismic performance in any systematic way. The comparison is not flattering, it is not meant to be. The Japanese earthquake early warning system deserves specific attention because it represents the kind of technological investment that requires both scientific infrastructure and institutional will to build and maintain. The system works by detecting the initial P wave of an earthquake, the faster, less damaging compressional wave that travels ahead of the slower, more destructive S wave, and using that detection to send automated alerts across the country in the seconds before the damaging shaking arrives. The warning time is brief. For locations close to the epicenter, it may be only a few seconds. For locations farther away, it can extend to tens of seconds, enough time to stop a bullet train, to pause a surgical procedure, to move away from a window to brace. The system is imperfect. It occasionally issues false alarms. It cannot provide meaningful warning to the area immediately surrounding the epicenter. But it has demonstrably reduced injuries in real earthquake events since its public deployment, and it has enabled automated safety responses in critical infrastructure, trains braking automatically, hospital systems activating backup power, factory machinery shutting down, that would otherwise require human decision-making in the seconds when human decision-making is least reliable. The United States has developed an early warning system for the West Coast called Shake Alert. It is operational in California, Oregon, and Washington. It covers the Pacific coast. It does not cover the new Madrid Seismic Zone. The central United States has no equivalent system providing public alerts. New Zealand rebuilt its approach to seismic preparedness following the 2011 Christchurch earthquake, which killed 185 people in a moderate magnitude 6.3 event, an event whose death toll was so high precisely because it hit a city whose older building stock was not prepared for even moderate shaking. The Christchurch disaster was, in some ways, a preview of what a major New Madrid event could look like, a city that believed its seismic risk was manageable, confronting the reality that manageable and managed are not the same thing. New Zealand's response was to rebuild Christchurch with serious seismic engineering standards, to accelerate national building assessment programs, and to invest substantially in public preparedness culture. The lesson was expensive, it was learned anyway. Chile experiences major earthquakes with a regularity that would be paralysing to a less accustomed society. The country sits on the Nazca Plate subduction zone and has produced some of the largest earthquakes ever recorded, including the 1960 Valdivia earthquake, the most powerful earthquake in recorded human history at magnitude 9.5. Chilean building codes are serious. Chilean emergency response systems are practiced. Chilean public awareness of earthquake risk is not the product of federal communication campaigns, it is the product of a culture that has experienced the consequences of being unprepared and made the collective decision not to repeat that experience. Taiwan, sitting on the boundary between the Philippine Sea Plate and the Eurasian Plate, has developed earthquake preparedness infrastructure and public education programs that consistently rank among the most effective in the world. The 1999 Chichi earthquake, magnitude 7.6, killed over 2,000 people and served as a national catalyst for reform. The reforms came, the preparedness improved. Subsequent earthquakes of comparable or greater magnitude in Taiwan have produced significantly lower casualty counts, not because the earthquakes were smaller, but because the society was better prepared. There is a pattern in all of these examples that is worth stating plainly. The countries and regions that have built serious earthquake preparedness cultures did not do so because their scientists were smarter or their governments more competent than those in the central United States. They did it because they had experienced catastrophic earthquakes within living memory, because the risk was impossible to deny, and because the cultural and political will to respond was generated by the visceral reality of what unprepared cities look like after the ground moves. The central United States has not had that galvanizing event in modern times. The last catastrophic New Madrid sequence was 214 years ago. There is no living memory of it. There is no scar in the cultural consciousness of Memphis or St. Louis equivalent to what Christchurch carries, or Kobe, or Valdivia. And so the preparedness investment has not come, because the demand for it has not been sufficiently urgent, because the urgency has not been sufficiently felt, because the event that would make it felt has not yet recurred. This is the trap. The preparedness that would save lives requires a cultural reality that only a disaster creates. But the point of preparedness is to act before the disaster, not after it. Japan did not build its earthquake culture only after Tohoku. It built it over generations through smaller events, through deliberate policy choices, through institutions that decided the science was sufficient justification for action, and did not wait for the catastrophe to prove the point. The Cascadia subduction zone, running off the Pacific Northwest coast, represents a hazard that researchers have compared to New Madrid in several ways. A fault capable of generating magnitude 8 or larger earthquakes, with a recurrence interval measured in centuries, with the last major event in 1700 CE. The preparedness gap along the Cascadia zone is real, and researchers have raised serious alarms about Pacific Northwest readiness. Oregon and Washington are not fully prepared for the Cascadia scenario. But compared to New Madrid, the Cascadia risk has been the subject of substantially more public discussion, more state-level investment, more cultural acknowledgement. A celebrated 2015 magazine article brought Cascadia risk to national attention in a way that New Madrid has never achieved. Oregon and Washington residents, while still underprepared by any rigorous standard, are at least broadly aware that they live in a seismic zone. The limiting factor at New Madrid is not the science. The science is clear enough to act on. It is not the technology. The engineering solutions for seismic retrofitting exist and are practiced in California and Japan. It is not the federal modelling. That modelling is already done, already published, already sitting in documents that any policymaker can read. The limiting factor is the will to treat a known, documented, federally modelled catastrophic hazard as the real and present danger that it is, rather than as the theoretical concern of scientists who specialise in things that have not happened lately. The gap between what other societies have built and what the central United States has built in response to its seismic hazard is not a gap of knowledge or capability. It is a gap of decision. And decisions, unlike geological processes, can be changed before the fault makes the choice for us. Part 24. Final Convergence. We began with a contradiction. America fears the San Andreas Fault. It has built its earthquake mythology around California, shaped its building codes around California's lessons, populated its disaster movies with Los Angeles skylines falling into the Pacific, and buried beneath the flat farmland and river corridors of the central United States, largely unknown to the 10 million people living above it, a fault system waits, one that has broken catastrophically at least 3 times in recorded history, that produces 200 earthquakes every year, that sits on soil that will liquefy under major shaking, beneath cities built in a generation that did not think it needed to worry. The geological evidence is not ambiguous about whether this fault has produced catastrophic earthquakes. It has. The stratigraphic record reaches back 4,500 years and shows the same signature of liquefaction and ground deformation repeating at intervals of roughly 500 years. The 1811 to 1812 events were not anomalies. They were one entry in a recurring series. The series did not begin with those events, and there is no geological evidence that it ended with them. The federal modelling is not ambiguous about what a repeat would mean. 86,000 fatalities, $300 billion in damage, 7 million people displaced, the Mississippi River severed, the Eastern Gas Network compromised, the national logistics infrastructure impaired at its most critical junctures. These figures come from operational planning documents produced by an agency whose purpose is to plan for disasters before they happen, documents that anyone can find with a standard internet search. What remains genuinely uncertain is the timing. The science cannot tell us whether the next major event is 20 years away or 200. The GPS instruments find near zero surface strain. The paleoseismic record suggests recurrence at roughly 500-year intervals, with substantial uncertainty around that estimate. The GPS silence may mean the fault is dying, as Seth Stein and his colleagues argue. It may mean the fault is loading through mechanisms that surface instruments cannot detect. The instruments cannot resolve this question, and it may be decades before the research community can. But here is what is not uncertain: the consequences if the ongoing hazard interpretation is correct and the current trajectory of under-preparation continues. Those consequences are modelled, documented and catastrophic in a way that is independent of when exactly the next event occurs. The buildings that will collapse in a major New Madrid earthquake are already built. The bridges that will fail are already carrying traffic. The people who will be displaced are already living in the exposure zone without insurance, without preparedness supplies, without the knowledge that the ground beneath them has a history they have not been told. The scientific community raised this concern quietly. The federal modelling documented it in detail. The regulatory system made incremental progress, and the population of one of the most seismically exposed regions in North America went to sleep each night on top of a fault that broke the continent 2 centuries ago, mostly unaware that the probability of it doing so again is not zero and may not even be small. There is a specific kind of failure that does not announce itself. It does not require a conspiracy, a cover-up, or even negligence in the ordinary sense. It requires only a gap between knowledge and communication, between what scientists know and what the public believes, wide enough for a civilization to build itself into a catastrophe in slow motion over many decades, one brick and one policy choice and one unchecked assumption at a time. The fault does not need headlines. It does not need legislation. It does not need belief. It sits beneath the alluvial plain of the Mississippi River Valley at the same depth it has occupied for 550 million years, accumulating whatever stress the mechanics of the North American plate deliver to it, indifferent to whether the cities above it have prepared or not. The thing about asymmetric risk is that it does not resolve neatly. There is no moment at which the uncertainty disappears and the correct decision becomes obvious. Waiting for that moment is itself a decision, one that has already been made by default for every year that the gap between known hazard and actual preparation has persisted. Return to the question we started with. The most dangerous fault in America is not in California. It runs through Missouri, Tennessee, Arkansas, Kentucky and Mississippi. It has a name, the New Madrid Seismic Zone, that almost no one in its exposure zone knows. It has a history that extends thousands of years into the past, and a federal record of potential consequences that should have reordered civic priorities across 5 states. And it waits, as it has waited through all of recorded human history in North America, not requiring anything from us except the attention that the evidence has long since earned. The surprise, when it comes, will not be geological. The geology has been telling the same story for 4,500 years. The surprise will be societal, the moment when the gap between knowledge and preparation closes not gradually through policy and preparation, but suddenly, violently, in the way that geological systems resolve their stored energy. The science is uncertain. The consequences are not. The fault does not need our attention. It just needs time.